It's always a judgment on events like this whether to interrupt the conversations that are happening, which are so much a part of, for those of us who are able to be here, so much a part of events like this, with connections made, ideas brewed, plans developed. But we must crack on because we've got a lot to get through. And next up, my chum Richard is going to come up. Richard, I'm going to click this because that's clearly panel done. Reflections. I've reflected. Richard. I'll give these folk a second or two as they drift back in. Subject to that, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll let everyone get their seats. I think everybody knows me. My name is Richard Cuerden. I'm wearing a number of hats. I work for TRL, the UK's Transport Research Laboratory. I'm part of the exec team there. TRL's a social enterprise. So I've got this rather nice job that I help set the strategy for the business. And so what we're going to be doing in the future will allow us to keep reinvesting back in ourselves to make transport better, which is great, if a little challenging at times. And I wear several other hats. One of my best hats I wear is I chair the PACTS Vehicle Design Working Party. And I do my very best to be at the meetings and fail quite regularly. So huge apologies to everyone at PACTS. I always do my best. It's a great organisation. And Jamie asked me if I would talk with this rather grand title. And the bit I thought I'd really try and focus on, especially because I was listening to everyone cover all of the really good ground that I was going to say this morning, was innovation. I spend a lot of my time talking about innovation, about automated vehicles or connected vehicles, or how do we get e-scooters on the road. So what do we mean by innovation? We mean kind of a new process or a new product or a new way of working. But the key thing about innovation is it's got to bring value. If it doesn't bring value, it isn't an innovation, it's just an idea. And I'm going to try and talk about what adoption means. And I'm going to try my very best to stick to time or even be a bit ahead of time. Let's see how I do. So, the slides aren't working. Never mind. I'll not let my... it's going to bug me now. Oh dear, oh dear. Don't worry, it's okay, it's my fault. It's okay. Larry and I had a chat earlier and I thought I checked and I didn't check well enough. So let's think about the market forces. What's going to change how we all want to get around as we go forward and where we are in the world? We've got all of these things that are happening and I'll go through them really quickly. Customer demand is key. We've already heard an awful lot about the fact that I now expect, and my sons especially expect, all of their products to arrive within about 24 hours to our doorstep in a 3.5-ton diesel van. And it comes off my credit card, and that's what they expect to happen. That is just the way of the world. I can pick up most newspapers and I can read about a war on a motorist. There was something on Radio 4 this morning, for those who were listening. It was being referred to because there was going to be more requirements on local authorities to look about how we look at low neighbourhood schemes. Okay? There's lots of political things going on and we've got huge changes in our regulatory landscape. You guys know about this and we know that more of us are starting to live in more dense urban areas. Safety is absolutely critical, but so is the planet. Okay, so there isn't just one thing going on here. So again, when we think about innovation, we think about safe systems. If I talk to my guys about safe systems, and I don't mention that the fact that at the moment we're going to be 2.9 degrees raising temperature the way we're going, and what that means, I'm not going to really win the battle. So apologies that the graphics aren't working very well on these slides, but when we talk about these other things, it's and safer, okay? So we're going to have to go and change the way we all get about if we're going to protect the planet. That means we're going to have to cycle more, we're going to have to walk more, we're going to have more active travel options. And if we don't change anything else, then we're going to have to accept we've got more casualties. So we have to change the whole lot at once and do it together in an intelligent way, which is not an easy thing to do because we've never done it before. And when you've never done anything before, you will get it wrong. So this is one of my favourite quotes. I thought we could get a bit of Machiavellian in there. People do not like change. That's my statement. Hopefully it's not too controversial. You can read that and have a think for yourself and work out where you are. There's some of us, of course, in the hype cycle. There's me who'll go out and buy all the new watches and technology. I'll love it. There's other people who perhaps might take a little bit longer and be a bit more sensible and not waste the money in the way I do. Okay, but we're all going to go towards technology or the ways of doing things differently at different rates. When we think about what's happened in vehicle safety, I'm going to talk about two examples of innovation that I think is really cool innovation in vehicle safety that lots of you will know about, but I'm going to frame it in an innovation speak. Okay? It takes a long time. So let me talk about the first one. Let's talk about type approval of vehicles. So if you go and buy a vehicle today, because for personal use or for work use or for both, as we're hearing from Heather, a lot of people are buying that van because they're using it to get the shopping and to get to and from work. There's a system. We have minimum requirements for vehicles. That used to be European Commission led, EU type approval and UN. And now we've had Brexit, so you've got GB type approval as well. So we've got divergence in systems. So we've got different ways that you approve a vehicle. You then have consumer testing, and then you have vehicle manufacturers, a lot of whom design their product to be even better than the Euro NCAP requirements. This is just to remind you, I'm so sorry about the graphics not working on the slides, it doesn't really matter. We talk about vehicles in class types. We have M, which are passenger vehicles. M1 is a car, M2 is a minibus, M3 is a coach, N1 is a light van, N2 is a, I can't remember what it's up to, 12 tons, 7.5 tons, and N3 is a HGV, I should know that. And this is a whole list of innovative measures that all came about and were regulated in Europe in 2002 in July. So every single one of them is a piece of innovation. And I'll talk about why it was innovative and the way they came together. Let's just use one example. One of my favourite examples is the frontal full width impact. People think, well, why is that so innovative? What's so clever about having a full width impact test for a vehicle? Well, it's pretty amazing if you're elderly or female. Because if you're elderly or female, you now have a test that at least means a vehicle designer thinks about designing that vehicle for you. Because up until now, it's not a requirement in this country to have a car that passes that test, so it's designed around the 50th percentile male in an offset impact test. By getting a full width test, we can make that restraint system and that vehicle structure work for different sorts of vehicle occupants. That's quite innovative, right? Intelligent speed assistance, we've seen it, heard it mentioned a lot. Really innovative. Comes with a bit of a bad press though, let me be honest with you guys, okay? I've spent the last 20 years talking about what we used to call intelligent speed adaptation. We renamed it as we were supporting the Commission in a regulatory sense to assistance because it had a much better resonance with the audiences, people we're talking to, with the readers of newspapers, with the general public. Read cameras or they can be based on maps. We briefed the whole of the European media before general safety regulations came into play and before we took them to the European Parliament. I spent hours of my life talking to the press about how this was an assistance feature. It would not limit your speed. You would drive as you wish to drive and it would advise you to drive in the speed limit where it could and it would tell you when it was struggling. We made that message absolutely crystal clear. We talked about protecting women in cars, we talked about protecting pedestrians, we talked about the whole measure of package, that the whole benefits this measure of package would come. The BBC is one of my favourite websites I use a lot. They ran with EU plans vehicle speed limiters from 2022. And that was all I was interviewed about. And that was all that the European Parliament then focused on, which is why the whole package of measures nearly didn't go through. It was a last minute bit of luck, if I'm honest, that got it through and over the line. I'm not going to talk through this slide, other than to say, when we think about introducing any measure or any package of measures or any change within a safe system, we have to think about the benefit-to-cost ratio. Innovation delivers a value. If I can't add up, which is all this slide is trying to show, if I can't show how each one of those measures reduces casualties, and how I can take those technologies and add up the cost of that technology and put them both in a context of how I can demonstrate how we as a society will save money and be better off, I'm going to struggle. Why is that really, really important? Remember what Heather was talking about in the conversation earlier. If I don't know how many casualties I've got to driving for work, how can I add up the costs that I'm trying to measure my benefit against? When you do this sort of analysis, you go through a whole bunch of really detailed assessments. You know, there's all sorts of inflationary economic tools that you have to use. It's so, so detailed, but the inputs are so poor that we're putting into these models in road safety compared to, say, the environment. So I think this is an example of type approval innovation that I'm really proud to have been a little bit involved in. It's revolutionised what's happening in Europe. It's really helped the EU motor industry as well get ready for what's coming with connected and automated vehicles by getting technologies in vehicles, understanding how and what data can be accessed and how that's going to be used going forward. Where are we in this country? Most of you in this room know this story, but I like to keep saying it. We're currently not decided what to do with the general safety regulations. So general safety regulations in this country mean that of that package of measures, if I buy a car in Northern Ireland or in France, it will have those measures as of July this year. So I'm going to be buying a vehicle that will work well for my daughter or for my mum, as well as for me. If I buy that vehicle here, I'm not guaranteed to get that. I think that's a real problem and something that we at PACTS and the Vehicle Design Working Party are going to keep on and on about. And that, in my view, is much more important right here, right now, than automated vehicles. As important as they are, because if we don't get this right and how we share data and how we do all the other things, the bits that follow are going to be really, really hard. So anyone who's interested in buying vehicles now, insist that it has that in your procurement spec. And the people you're buying it off won't know, and that'll be an interesting conversation. Very last example, and then I'm going to rattle to the end, I promise. Transport for London deserve an awful lot of credit because they have a Vision Zero, which is amazing, and they looked at the bus safety, the incidents they were having on buses, and they really applied some science as to how could you make bus journeys safer in London. And there was a whole package of measures to protect people on the bus, people around the bus, the drivers. All of that was looked at in totality, and a set of requirements were imagined what that would look like. But if you do that on its own, if you just do that and you say, right, now world, give me buses like this, how's that going to happen? So Transport for London had the foresight to actually work with the bus manufacturers, who happen, by the way, to be British largely, so you're helping British industry. Worked with the bus operators and said, look, if you want to run buses in London, you've got to have buses that will meet these standards, and this is how we'd expect you to buy these new buses over this time with these standards on board. Is that okay? They had conversations, they brought people on board, they developed the specifications, people understood what was to be achieved, and all agreed. Pretty impressive, right? And they've just recently won loads of awards, and congratulations to TfL. We helped with some of this work, and again, I was really sort of privileged to be a small part of it. So, coming to the end, really, we've had lots of conversation about where is this innovation going to come from? Well, it has to come from everywhere. And Jonathan was having a great challenge, I think, talking about, well, who are the leaders? Who's going to bring that group of people together? Because what Safe Systems says is we are all responsible for safety. But if we're all responsible for safety, we can all, therefore, none of us be. We have to work out what that means. Okay? And that's where we have a responsibility, especially when we talk to the media, especially when we talk to the politicians and the people who are going to be making these decisions. I was going to talk about HSE and DVLA, and I'm not going to, because I think enough has been said. Remember this, define the problem, work out what the casualty problem is, work through what you need to do to prevent those casualties and do a full impact, a holistic approach, look at the cost benefits. And then when you've done that, what are my recommendations? I want an industrial strategy that just doesn't talk about AI and the future and just doesn't talk about the aging population. It links it to transport, it links it to needs. But how would that then be able to reference what was required? Well, there'd be a national road safety framework. So we'd understand the sorts of things we were doing, because that's linked to an industrial strategy. That's how we're going to make our money. That's how we're going to employ people. We're going to level up the safety at work requirements by doing that. You're going to be as safe if you're operating a machine in a factory as driving the vehicle. You're going to be looked after in the same way, because we're going to think about what that requires. What's required to achieve that. We're going to capture the lessons learnt. And really importantly, if you look at how much money we spend in this country on R&D through Innovate UK, PSRC, and all of the various universities and research that I happily spend a lot of that money on, by the way. Thank you very much, all the funders. Let's link that together, the R&D. Let's really think about how that works to that top level. And I'm nearly there. Let's develop economic assessments that work. Let's get the data we need and strive for that. Let's make sure that we're designing this thing so we adopt the innovation. If all we do is really good technology, there's some great work on lots of technologies that I'm involved in, but if we never see those technologies adopted, what was the point? And last but not least, how can it be achieved? That's what we should all be thinking about. And I'm sorry my slide formatting all fell apart. And I'm sorry that I stressed Larry out by that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Richard. And there will be a chance to chat over the lunch break later, but with no further ado, let's crack on. Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I wear, like Richard, I wear a range of hats, one of which is the Director of Operation Road Safety in Jacobs. So that's road worker safety, road user safety, and other party safety. Think Selby rail crash. If you don't get your road environment right, you can get harm on somewhere that isn't the network you're on, which wasn't really considered. But I also support our strategic corporate team in the operational side of managing our safety. So we work in design and network management in the transport infrastructure side. We support highway authorities who are Transport Scotland, Welsh Government, as well as National Highways and lots of local highway authorities. So working across all of that gives me that kind of context of what do we do in practice. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the context in which transport safety looks for us as an organisation, I think, because that's very relevant, especially in the discussion we had earlier. And then some of the components of it. What does that look like for us? And how does that work? Why is it good? So the context, don't you read, I think we're showing the slides afterwards. The key is it's around thinking about people as human capital. We talk about a sort of culture of caring. I mentioned earlier the case story video, which every member of our staff goes through this induction. It's got a commitment, you know, it's lots of hours of people not at work because they're doing behavioural safety induction. We do it because we know it works. If you create that culture about people looking out for each other, social responsibility for their colleagues, their staff as line managers and the public that are affected by what we do, you're more likely to get benefit than holding the stick. You know, carrot's really important. So the safest journey is the journey not taken. That's the start point. And the safest journey is the journey not driven if you don't need to drive. Now, we started this at least 20 years ago. We were ridiculed in the industry when we started that. You know, I'd go to meetings with contractors that we won't name who would say, oh, Jacob's not allowed to drive anywhere. Your nanny won't let you drive. Now, they get it. They get that if you arrive on a train, you arrive refreshed. You can have a little sleep and nobody dies. You can do some work on the train. From a well-being point of view, it has a real value. So context is everything. So we look at this around a kind of social value, human capital context. What does driver health, safety and sustainability look like together? And that then takes you to a place of travel risk management. And it is travel risk. It's not driving risk, it's travel risk. If you start with a point of view, it's a driving policy, you've lost. It has to be travel risk. And Eric, it doesn't really matter what you call the four components, but you know, the principle, if you don't need to travel, you don't have to. On day one in lockdown, we had no difficulty because we already got to a position where we had normalised not needing to travel for work. We did travel for work. Interestingly, in lockdown, we stopped work travel in about 1st of February 2020. We saw the risk coming of it being a transport risk as well as an infection risk. And we just said, people don't need to travel, we'll stop travel, we'll manage it. So you do need to understand where that comes from. So then, what are the components that looks like? Culture is the absolute most important. If you don't get the culture right, as I said earlier, it's a bit like Health and Safety at Work Act. You start from the point of view of saying, what does good look like? It looks like thinking about risk in the round and delivering your objectives as an employer in a context of managing. So that's things like, at every level, leadership, policy, messaging, behaviour. All meetings start with safety moments, culture of caring moments, and that might be anything from, there's some examples here of ones that I use. Tyre tread, replacing your tyres at 3 mil, not 1.6 mil, using those videos that show here's the 3 mil vehicle, it's now stopped, the 1.6 mil vehicle is continuing this many car lengths. Storytelling around safety. Don't overfill a diesel tank late at night. Expansion the next day when the temperature is higher means you'll be leaking diesel onto the road, taking out motorcyclists. Health benefits of active travel. The graphic at the top right I love. This is from The Guardian. This is all causes of death. And people think cycling risk is a terribly high thing, but actually, it's consistently, it's 100 people a year in the UK, which is tiny in all sense. The benefits of active travel dwarf the transport risk of active travel. But if we don't see that big picture, it's evidence-based. This is one thing you ask MPs and prospective MPs on the doorstep, ask them if they understand, this context of relative risk. So that culture, if it's visible in every part of everything you do, that permeates through. And I gave some examples earlier about, paying for people to stay overnight. Some of it's about, walking the walk and paying for things. But some of it's about a culture that people know they don't even need to ask. They know that you'll pay for it because they know that's a safe way to operate. People cut corners when your messaging subliminally says it's okay to do things cheaply. So that's where the culture comes in for me. The second part of that package is about policy, and I say it's all travel, not just driving. You need a clear chain of command for approvals and reporting. Everything must be reported, and if you do it in a blame-free context, people will report incidents. 25 years ago, we had a clerk of works injured. He was hit by a vehicle in a roadworks, and he didn't report it because he said, I thought I might get somebody in trouble if I reported it. That's what happens if you have an attitude where you say we do blame-free, but you don't. So it has to cover all modes. We prohibit motorcycling as a mode of travel for work because there are alternatives. It's risk-based. It's based on a fact that you don't need to motorcycle for work, whereas you might need to cycle for work. We design cycle infrastructure. Anyone who's read LTN 120 and gear change, it says the people designing and assessing cycle infrastructure must be cyclists. The wording's a bit grey. It says must have experience of cycling on the road, and it's not clear whether they mean the specific road you're assessing or in a general sense, but the principle is really powerful. Unfortunately, not many organisations or indeed highway authorities kind of got that, but it's critical. So you might need to cycle for work. Never mind, it's got an active travel benefit that dwarfs the road risk impact. A really interesting study in Barcelona, I think 74 times the benefits to the risks, years lost to life, was something like 74 times higher, even when you include road risk and pollution risk. So we permit cycle, but we manage it because we say it has a higher risk per mile travelled. Interestingly, the fatality risk per mile travelled for walking is higher, but some of that's not the same populations. If you look at who gets injured, cycling injuries tend to be to fit, healthy, active people. Walking injuries include elderly pedestrians who might fall into the road and sustain an injury. It's not the same population, so like for like, it's not quite as simple as it might look. So we manage that. We have hire contracts for hire cars. We make it really easy to drive the safe car. You can demand a 5-star car from our hire provider. We actually have multiple hire providers. We have a primary one, but we have backups. So if one company doesn't have a car available. They do collect and return. They will pick you up and take you to their base to pick up the car. Or they'll deliver it to your home or your office or another location from a station. You make it really easy. You get the train most of the way, then you pick up the hire car. You're driving fewer miles, your risk is reduced. It's all about evidence. The priority is to minimise miles travelled as in total, specifically driving, by individual and by day. I'll come to reporting in a minute. To control long journeys, so we even look at who's driving how many miles. We monitor that. All of this stuff's automated and very easy to use. So an evidence-based approach is about reducing workers' injury risk, but also reducing the risk to the public, this sort of reputational corporate social responsibility. So the data, Who drives? We look at, do they drive their own vehicle or a hire vehicle? If they drive their own vehicle, we automate the collection of their insurance, their vehicle MOT status, their insurance status. If you don't have all those bits of paper in place, you don't drive. And it's linked to the expenses system, and your expenses are audited. If you haven't got a travel approval in advance, you know if something happens, even if it wasn't your fault, you weren't authorised. You won't get paid for the journey, but more importantly, if you have an incident, it will be visible you didn't get travel approval. You do need a little bit of fear as well as a good culture, because some people will always not toe the party line. So you need that power. So we monitor travel by individuals, unauthorised travel, that's travel without a permit to drive. So each year we do a permit to drive, and we go through testing and assessment to do that. Every member of staff who drives is risk assessed, every single member of staff. And we do on-road training for people who need that. We measure incidents, we measure miles travelled, we measure beyond zero observations, that's near miss, good practice and bad practice reporting. We know that in hospitals, more near miss reporting associates with fewer deaths from complications. It's not that the reporting specifically is what changes the adverse outcomes. It's that culturally, if you have good systems in place, you have bad outcomes across a wide range of dimensions. And we automate the reporting and notification, so nobody has to collate spreadsheets. It's all automatic. Car hire, I've mentioned, we make it really easy. One provider for clarity and consistency, but with a backup if needed. Euro NCAP awareness, making sure staff know about the 5-star cars. I'm amazed how many people in the public don't know. Really important. Making checking the hire car part of that routine, so that you have to make sure are its tyres okay, has it got fuel, and so on. And understand unfamiliar controls. We talked about driver assistance technologies, image at the bottom of a road with no centre line but advisory cycle lanes. We've had several incidents where staff in hire cars with lane keep assistance on a road like this, the car has pulled them into oncoming traffic because it's misread the opposing cycle lane as the centre line. Understand the technology and how it works. Training, we have a huge range of training resources. We all have a kind of interface. We go in and see what training we need to do. We get automatically enrolled if you're a driver on these incidents. We monitor incidents and use that to update training because parking is low injury but high frequency as a proportion. So we do parking related, and then high severity injuries, junctions and lane changing and so on. They have pick up. I've deliberately blurred this, but this is what percentage of staff have done what training, and by monitoring that we can see who's not doing which things. Actually the ones that are low risk aren't really related to driving at all, but we monitor who's doing it and it's getting better or worse, and we use that to improve systems. Task specific planning, every single journey is planned and managed in advance. Quick and easy system online to report it, goes to your line manager. If they're not around, you can divert it to someone else. It means the journey is reported and approved. And if you haven't done a travel safe plan of action in advance of the journey, your expenses won't get paid. Amazing how people are motivated. So in summary, we have a comprehensive set of components, and it is the combination of those, and there's a lot of parallels to what Richard was saying about, it is the aggregate of all these things together, individually and how they work collectively. Automating it, it has to be meaningful to drivers, not just feel like a sort of, token gesture, make it serious, and that the benefits then accrue to other people, not just our staff. And the image at the bottom is one of my safety moments we use, is don't put your feet on the dashboard in a moving car because your knees will break your face and then break your pelvis. It's storytelling. People are motivated by storytelling and we find it works. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, it says it on the screen. David, the floor's yours.
Now, I haven't really checked whether all my videos are going to play automatically, so I may be coming to you to manually try some. Okay, so I am going to be talking, again, continuing on the theme of safe systems, but about safe road users. Oh, no, it doesn't work. Never mind. Nope, none of the animations work. Okay, so this is going to be a little messed up, unfortunately. So we're looking at safe road users. And we know that human error is a causal factor in most collisions, but when you look at the actual studies, people say, oh, 90%. Well, actually, many of the studies, that number varies, but generally the take-home theme is a lot. A lot of these collisions are due to or human error or human behaviour at some point. When we look at the fatal and serious collisions and their contributory factors, we can see that speeding or inappropriate speed tends to be at the top of the list. This is for 2022 figures. But there's some usual suspects that you might expect in the rest of the list: tailgating, distraction, fatigue, traffic light violations, etc. When we look at the causes of fleet road safety problems, what we're wanting to do now is to try and boil this down and understand why these crashes happen. So if you're looking at your accidents, or your collisions, and trying to work out what the causes of them are, then you want to know why tailgating was happening and why that led to a collision. Well, we can slice this in many different ways. One way I like to do it is talk about these four things here: the knowledge of the driver or lack of knowledge, the attitudes to risk that the driver has, the transitory states, and this can be anything from alcohol through to an emotion, and skills as well. And I'm not talking really about driving skills, controlling the vehicle, I'm talking more about higher order cognitive skills. Of course, there are organisational issues as well, culture, etc. Fortunately, I'm not talking about those, otherwise I'd have been repeating a lot of what was said in the previous talk. So, this is where it really, really does fail, unfortunately, because the nice animation hid this part of the screen. So let's just move on from that and say, what is the speed limit here? I mean, obviously, if you didn't see that there was a repeater there, what sort of knowledge might you be using? Genuine question. So, street lamps, yes. So if you've got street lights there and no repeater sign, then you might consider that this is a 30-mile-an-hour zone, even though you've got multiple lanes. Of course, when you extend out the image and you see that you have got the repeater sign there, we now know that the speed limit is... Oh, you're in a car, by the way? 60. I would have expected everyone here to say 60. Of course I would. But you'd be surprised how many people that you come across, certainly with my Endors hat on, who don't necessarily know what the definition of a dual carriageway is. And they don't realise that you've got to have some sort of central barrier or reservation to turn that into a dual carriageway. It's not about the lanes, but you will have people thinking that that's a 70 speed limit for their car. So, let's look at each of these in order. I'm going to look at knowledge first and then move through the rest with some examples from our own research. The nice thing about a lack of knowledge is, well, it's easy to assess knowledge. You give people a quiz, find out what they know, what they don't know. And it's easy to train knowledge. You just tell them what they don't know. But is that the real problem? Well, a bit of research that we've done suggested not really in this particular case. 130 drivers, we gave them a smart motorway knowledge questionnaire, and we checked whether their knowledge was as good as a group of Endors trainers. And surprise, surprise, it wasn't. They didn't really have that knowledge base. We also asked the same drivers how they behaved on smart motorways, their behaviour or their compliance. And what we found was there was no relationship between the knowledge that they had and the behaviour, the compliance that they do on the road. So that's interesting. Knowledge wasn't working. In fact, the only thing that statistically predicted their compliance on smart motorways was actually their driving experience. More experienced drivers, more likely to comply with safety rules on smart motorways. And that is pretty much the same story that you'll get with other studies into knowledge. Knowledge isn't really a strong predictor of crash likelihood. That's not to say that you don't need to worry about knowledge at all. Of course, that's got to be a base foundation. But in studies, it suggests it's not the worst culprit. Then we've got bad attitudes. Now, this is going to be doing something interesting, it looks like. Oh, you fixed it. Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, bad attitudes. I've put them in speech marks because I don't think that everyone gets in a car in the morning and thinks, I'm going to do something really dangerous today and have a crash. What they're doing is they're basically using their own sort of safe system, their own naive view of the world, which is based on how good they think they are in relation to the rest of the world. And when you get these violators, they're often overestimating their own skills, unfortunately. And they're often suffering from optimism bias. What we mean by that is they just don't think that they're going to end up in a crash. Unfortunately, they tend to be more likely to end up in a crash. And that's where the problem is. The people who think they're least at risk are perhaps most at risk. So how do we deal with these violators? Well, there's a number of ways. And again, this is a highly selective talk in such a short amount of time. But telematics, in-cab monitoring, that sort of stuff is, of course, widely used to try and monitor fleet drivers to see whether they are behaving themselves. Now, this is a good way of doing it because what you're trying to do is, yes, you want to analyse your crash statistics, you want to look at all of that, but ideally you want to try and do something that is prior to those collisions. And monitoring violations, which we know are likely to lead to collisions, is a potentially good way of doing it. However, it's only useful, and we heard Mark Cartwright mention this, if the managers make use of the data. We went into one company and we found that at least some of their managers had so many speed notifications coming in, they were diverting them to a side folder because they didn't want their inbox cluttered up with them. They were coming up with rationales for why speed was coming in so thick and fast. Oh, well, they've just gone from a 40 to a 30 and not slowed down. Well, that still doesn't make it any better. So if you don't use the data, then the telematics system is just an expensive white elephant. Also, at the end of the day, it's still retrospective. Those violations have still happened. Surely what we also need then is to be trying to look at this chain of behaviour even earlier, maybe spotting our violators beforehand. And a lot of companies do use risk-based profilers, so a series of questions given to their drivers to try and see which drivers are more dangerous than others. Now, this is going to be a little question for you also. I want some hands up when you see the next question. How many of you sometimes speed up when you see an amber light ahead? Let's have a show of hands there. Well, thank you very much to those candid responses there. Of course, what I'm interested in here is not how many people are owning up to this in this room. What I'm interested in is what went through your head when I flashed that question up. And it's likely that some of you thought, yeah, I do speed up sometimes to get through that amber light, but on the other hand, I'm not going to be putting my hand up here in front of this august audience and revealing that. That's what we call social desirability. It's a question that you know what the ideal answer is, and you might be tempted to fib a little. Imagine the situation now where you're started with a company and your job, as you might think about it, depends on the answers that you're giving to these questions. At that point, social desirability is a real problem in these sorts of risk profilers. Fortunately, we think we've got other ways to try and spot violators and assess and profile their risk. Now, let's see if these videos will work. Oh, that's brilliant. Excellent. So, these are a series of behavioural tests now to try and get at the risk profile of drivers. This is our amber light test, for instance. As you're approaching a traffic light, the light goes to amber. Now, you've got some idea about the speed you're travelling at. You've got some idea about the distance when the light goes to amber, the complexity of the junction, etc., etc. Then we ask, would you be likely to go through that amber light? Now, some of these clips stop when you're so close to that amber light, actually, you have to go through. The highway code would suggest you would go through, because if you slam your brakes on, you're just going to end up in the junction. Some of them go to amber when you're so far back, then really you can't go through that, because by the time you get to it, it will be red. Most of those clips fall into a nice ambiguous stage. So now it's really hard to have social desirability in these questions, because the driver who's looking at these video-based questions, admittedly, doesn't know whether they should be saying go through or should be saying they would brake. And that's where you start to get more risky drivers willing to accept clips where they're further back from the amber light to say they'd go through. And we can do this with tailgating as well. And this one is our T-junction safety pull-out test. That's the one that's not gone through validation yet, but it is going through it. So that was 2 elements. On to the third element, transitory states. Simple as drink, drugs and fatigue because they're in your system or you are fatigued. But, you know, give it a little time and then that has passed. These are, I wouldn't say easily dealt with, but education and spot tests, that sort of thing, you can manage the risk there. Far harder to manage it with something like emotions. It's very easy to say to someone, if you get angry, you run the risk of having a collision. They can understand that in a theoretical sense, but that doesn't necessarily stop them getting angry right in the moment. And of course, we've got distraction as well. In-cab, out-cab, mobile phones are the big sort of bugbear there. I'm just going to talk about these 2 a little more. First of all, in terms of emotions, and we're going a bit left field here, we're going to talk about mindfulness. Now, 5 years ago, we started a study sponsored by the Road Safety Trust where we trained up drivers in mindfulness. We started out with quite a big course, 12 hours over 4 weeks, and we compared their behaviour subsequently to a control group of drivers. And we did this in a simulator, we did it on a hazard test, and we also did it where we put devices into their cars and monitored them for a couple of weeks. And what we found was our mindful drivers had greater anger control, had more sensitivity to hazards, and when they were out driving in their real cars, they had fewer instances of harsh acceleration. In fact, it was almost significant that we found fewer instances of harsh braking as well. Just didn't quite make the cut for statistics on that. So that's great. So that maybe there are ways we can handle emotions. But 12 hours of mindfulness training is a bit much. So now what we're doing is we're boiling this down into small 3-minute videos. This is a project we did with the British Horse Society and with Cycling UK, looking at trying to provide mindful techniques to drivers to allow them to deal with anger and frustration when faced with vulnerable road users in the road ahead. We've just finished a study on this, comparing people who watch these videos with people who watched control videos, and we're getting very positive results about their future intended behaviours around VRUs. Now, distraction. Distraction is one of the big problems that we face, especially in-cab distraction with mobile phones, even if it's just looking down for a second to check your sat-nav, as is going to be in this clip any second. There we go. Thought I'd got my timings all wrong there. But that means that anything can happen when you come out of that period of distraction. So mobile phones, obviously a big problem, in-car devices. But of course, as we all know here, hands-free mobile phones are just as dangerous as handheld phones, because it's not necessarily the act of holding the phone, it's the act of the conversation that you're having. So what we wanted to do here, again, we went into a company that had a hands-free mobile phone ban. But when we started talking to their drivers, we found that they were all using hands-free phones. So we wanted to know why. So we asked over 500 of them, what's your reasons for using hands-free phones? What are your excuses that you use to justify your behaviour? We didn't say it like that, we said it a little more friendly. But essentially, that's what we were after. When we got their key excuses, we've then created what we call a microdose training video, a bit like the last session, that we can drop into people's emails or inboxes on a periodic basis. And this video challenged those 5 key excuses. I won't go into what those 5 key excuses were, but if you're interested, we can let you have access to the video. And again, in a randomized control trial comparison, our participants who have seen this video have much more favorable attitudes towards restricting mobile phone communication in the future. Skills, point 4. So we're getting towards the end. Again, not talking about the act of driving, talking about higher order skills like concentration, visual scanning, hazard perception, and decision making. I'm very into hazard perception, so that's what I'm going to talk to you about here. For me, I think hazard perception assessment and training are very useful for fleet drivers. They really haven't made it into fleets yet, because you can identify those drivers with the poorest skills and you can train them up. In fact, even the highly experienced drivers, ones which are relatively safe, can still have their hazard perception skills improved. And the benefit of this in terms of high-risk behaviour, remember, we're talking about people having their own little safe system ideas about how they feel that they can interact with the world. And that's based on how dangerous they think the world is to them and to their skill set. Well, if you train them up in spotting danger, they become more aware of the potential dangers in the world. They become less likely to engage in things like distracting activities within the cab or speeding, etc., etc. So that is the benefit of increasing skill in hazard perception within this group. And I might need you to press the video on this one, unless I can do that from here. And this is just an example clip taken from our VR training within a headset. Can you click on the actual video? There we go. So this is a clip taken, we do this on the basis that we put them through these hazard clips, they get to see what's happening, then we take them back through it, and a voiceover is explaining why they should have been focusing on different parts of that clip and what it means for their particular crash risk. In this one, we had a car that nipped out from the left and right in front of the HGV as the HGV was just moving off. Important things here, because you're in 360, you get to see all of the world, and it's vehicle specific, unlike the DVSA hazard perception test, which is just car-based. So in conclusion, humans have got their own idiosyncratic safe systems that dictate their behaviour, and these are the things that we've got to understand. Yes, you've got to analyse collisions, you've got to monitor performance, and ideally assess your drivers. Once you've found out what those problems are and you understand the reasons for them, that's when you can intervene. Whether that's microdose training by dropping videos that challenge their wrong beliefs into their inboxes, or whether it's any of those other forms of training or monitoring through telematics, toolbox talks, or even nowadays VR training, you can select the right tool to deal with the appropriate problem. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, David. And just briefly from me then, before we break for lunch, I think a colleague I had many years ago said something to me that's always stuck with me, which is that we were talking loosely. We were saying about people behaving irrationally. And what they said was, you got this wrong. People behave rationally. If you think they're behaving irrationally, you just haven't understood the world as they're seeing it. A lot of what we've talked about, a lot of the last session we've been talking about, is about how we, let's face it, all of us, behave as drivers. Something we need to think about is there's something odd, isn't there, going on in the mind of the completely rational chief executive of the companies that we're talking about. Because as matters stand, those chief executives apparently are not behaving like the chief executive of Jacobs. But they're quite rational people. They're very successful in their businesses. Somebody somewhere is thinking, that person, they're the right person to run our business, or that those board members are the right people to run the board. Something I think we need to think about is, so what's going on there? Not just what's going on here. This session I thought was absolutely fascinating, because what it's telling us, what it's telling me, is the future vehicle, the near future vehicle, frankly, many of the vehicles on the road right now, will do lots of clever things and they'll tell us lots of clever stuff. There's ways of thinking about how we could encourage the right behaviours, and, good news, there's ways of doing it. There's ways of assessing our staff, our people, and there's ways of helping them get better. But, I'll take you back to that first point. In the real world, nothing happens unless somebody makes it happen. And what we need to think about, I think, and we might well come back to this afternoon, is who's that then? How are we going to get that person to think about it? I'm going to be completely unfair here before we go to lunch, because I'm going to go back to Kate for a second. Because somebody in Jacobs clearly came in one day and said, right, we're going to change. Or maybe they came in and said, we're going to change, I'm going to persuade the board, we're going to change. Do you know who that was? Do you know what happened?
It was the Texas oil refinery incident, and we got a company in to help us go through that journey and say, what do we need to change to stop an incident like that happening again? And the travel planning is part of that. But we recruit for personality and culture over experience, and there's no point in having business acumen if you've got the wrong culture. So it becomes self-fulfilling in a helpful way, because the leadership at that time, which is Noel and Craig, had that culture already, but they realised they had a policy that was based on the world they'd like to be, not the world it actually was. So our approach to safety changed, not that our attitude changed, but our approach how to get what you want changed. And that, we've interviewed brilliant people, and when the first question in every interview is, tell me about a time when you saw something that was unsafe and you had to intervene. And the way they respond to that question often tells you, you might get the psychopath and give you a very polished answer, but generally you do get a good feeling for somebody's relationship to safety. It's not knowledge, it's your personal relationship.
There you have it. If there's one key learning point from this morning, knowledge is great. Knowledge is better than data. Data is just data. Knowledge is data put to some use, but it's not of any use if you don't put it to use. That's my bombshell thought for this morning. I'm going to hand over the baton shortly. Before we do that, we're going to have a lunch break for roughly 45 minutes, back in here just after past. Lunch is going to be served in the room next door that way, which is called the Mal Room. Look forward to seeing you back here. Perhaps we could have just one more round of applause for the presenters. And cheerio, those joining us on camera.